that I do.
Yeah, from my previews.
So I would like to officially welcome everyone. Welcome to the ABCD GIS October meeting. I'm Jeff Blossom with the Center for Geographic Analysis, and it's good to see a lot of unfamiliar faces, certainly a lot of familiar faces. But for those of you who it's your first time, we meet once a month, and we bring in interesting speakers that have things to say, usually technical talks about the geospatial industry or geographic information systems. Today we are delighted to have Tina Cormier. She's with TELUS Labs. She's a remote sensing scientist there. And she was here back in August as part of the FOSS4G conference and did a workshop on using R for spatial analysis. CGA colleague Lex Berman made a connection there and said it'd be great to have you back to talk more about this. And so here she is. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Tina.
Thank you. Thank you guys very much for having me. I'm excited to be here and share some R stuff with you. Thanks to Lex for inviting me. As Jeff said, we met at FOSS4G, which was a wonderful event that we held here in Boston this year, which was great, the international conference. Was anyone there? Yeah. It was a good one. I like that one. So yeah, I'm a remote sensing scientist at TELUS Labs. We're a small startup, only been in business since January, so really a startup. But we work to take in streams of satellite imagery. Right now we're focused mostly on MODIS because we're looking over large areas and we can get it at a rapid cadence and turn that into information or insights into economic issues or environmental issues. And we kind of have two groups, one using Python and one using R. The data scientists are sort of split using both. I use R, obviously. Probably need to learn some Python also so we can talk, cross-collaborate. But yeah, so I'm wondering, of the people here, how many people use R or have ever used R? Cool. How many would say you use it a lot? Cool. Well, some of this stuff might be a little bit introductory for you, but hopefully you pick up a few things along the way too. What about Python? MATLAB. Cool. All right. So a lot of you guys have used programming before in your work. Is anyone new to programming? Awesome. So because this is a little bit of a longer talk than I usually do, I'm like, I better do an outline. Don't want to have any surprises for people. So basically, I'm going to start off with what is R and why should you consider using it for any of the geospatial tasks you might have. We all know it's a good programming language if you're doing stats or modeling, but you can also do your geoprocessing in there and why you might want to think about doing that. And that leads kind of into what can you do with R, and I'll show you a whole bunch of examples of things that I've done with R. And we'll talk about the challenges because it's not an easy language. I'll give you some examples with code so that you can see sort of what the syntax looks like if you haven't used it before, and what, if you have used it before, what the geo stuff kind of looks like. And then I'll present a short case study on some work that I did with the Woods Hole Research Center. I worked there for the last 8 years before coming to TELUS, and we did some work on forest biomass, well, a lot of work on forest biomass mapping, and that work is exclusively done in R. So it's an example of a project that is pretty much start to finish R. Some of the maps were made in QGIS, but other than that, the whole analysis, data prep, cleaning, spatial analysis, the stats and modeling, even the Lidar work we're now doing in R. So it's kind of just a good A to Z example. So what is R? If you're new to R, it's an open source software project and a programming language. It has over 10,000 contributed packages, which essentially means that anything that you want to do is probably already ready to go. Somebody has already done it. If not, because it's open source, you can write your own. It's most widely known in circles like this, academic circles and data scientists, students using it for stats. but it's lesser known as a fully functional GIS, which it really has become in the last 5 years or so. And I showed this in my FOSS4G talk. Does anyone follow GIS Tribe on Twitter? It's just a hashtag that people use on Wednesdays at 3 usually, but also throughout the week. But it's kind of a chat where like the person who came up with this will kind of pose a topic and everybody kind of talks about it. And I tweeted, I was super excited because this new Lidar package came out, and I plotted one of my field plots, and I could spin it and animate it and all this stuff, and I just tweeted it innocently. And then someone tweeted, "This is the new GIS," and there was like a fit. People were like, "Oh my God, I don't want to learn this. It's horrible. It's hard. I tried and put it down so many times." And so I'm definitely not here to evangelize R. You should use it. You should use the tool that works the best. But it might be a new tool in your tool belt for geo stuff if you haven't done that before. So why should you think about using R? Most of you guys said you were programmers, at least to some degree. So this slide is really not, this is preaching to the choir. But free and open source, okay, so you don't have to pay for it, and you can change it to suit your own needs. The big one for me on this slide is the second one, where your analysis becomes repeatable, which is super important probably for everyone in this room. And it's automated. So you basically have a list of everything you did for your analysis, the data sets that you use. You can repeat it, hopefully, at any point you need to. And you reduce your carpal tunnel because you're not clicking through thousands of images or data sets, shapefiles, whatever you're using. So it's kind of an all-in-one. You're documented. I'll show you an example of a project that I'm doing right now, creating. Has anyone used R notebooks? Super cool. Yeah, so it's in Markdown. You can kind of have your code in a document, and you can put text around it and put your figures in there, and you can write a report that way. Some people have even written books that way, but it's nice sort of just as a lab notebook, like we did this because we found blah, 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 and then plots. And so I'll show you an example of what that looks like later. And then a number of other good reasons. It's platform independent. So basically anyone can use it. There's a huge user community, so it's easy to get help. And I mentioned before about the packages. Oops. So I'm just going to flip through a couple of examples here, and I know that I'm focusing on the graphical stuff because R is super good at that. But also, when you're looking at these, think about the work that went in behind it, right? There's a whole bunch of data prep. I don't know about you guys, but I spend more time cleaning my data and getting it formatted properly than actually doing any of the modeling that I'm trying to do. It seems like the modeling is so much easier than getting the data ready. So think about that as we're kind of going through, but these are probably plots that you would feel comfortable and familiar looking at, some box plots. This was from a freelance project that I did modeling a freshwater mussel species that is up for the endangered species list. So we had to bring a bunch of documentation as to why it's so threatened and declining. And so these are not good box plots, but they're box plots and they're pretty. And that was the accompanying model, some of the output of the model results. We were modeling the population viability in certain areas. So this was the results of a random forest model where you see the variable importance and some accuracy assessment materials at the bottom. And this is from that same project where we're looking at histograms that are stacked based on the population condition. So right away, you can see, I don't know if you guys can read this very well, but let's look at, I don't know, here. So mean slope, you can kind of see they don't like, you can see some trends in here. I don't want to draw any conclusions, but but yeah, so you can kind of see some trends where here we're looking at minimum temperature, and that seems to not be great if it's increasing. We looked at temperature trends and climate change over the last 100 years. Over here is some, just predicted versus observed. That's for a different project. Obviously, we're here because we're interested in some geospatial work. So you can make maps in R. I still kind of, if I need to make a nice map for a publication, I will probably do it in QGIS. However, R's cartographic prowess has been getting a little bit better, and there's a whole bunch of examples online if you want to check out the R graph gallery. That's a good thing to look at, and you can usually there's code with it, so you can find something that looks like what you want to do, get some base code going, and tweak it as you go. On the right is some of the Lidar work that I've done. So on the bottom is a digital terrain model that was extracted from the Lidar. This is actually Lidar from my house. This is up in Maine. And I'll talk more about this, a lot more about this later, about the Lidar. Does anyone work with Lidar? Cool, all right. So I'll talk a lot more about Lidar processing later. These are some plots that I've done for TELUS Labs. Most of the other stuff, I haven't worked with TELUS Labs long enough to produce a lot, but these are hexagon grids just showing the relationship between one of our vegetation indexes and yield, crop yields. And we have bazillions of points, so I used hexagons to kind of summarize and see where the greatest density of points are. And these are just a few days during the year, and you can see that the relationships are changing. It's also very casual here. If you have questions as we go, just stop me and ask. This one's another one. So we're looking at correlation over time, so days of the year versus correlation for various vegetation indices that we use to predict yield. And these are just 4 different vegetation indices that we're using. Think like NDVI, EVI type of stuff for anyone in here who does remote sensing. And in the background, we've got phenological periods highlighted so we can see if they line up to when we're seeing a positive correlation. That's ggplot. So just kind of an example of some neat graphics. But I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the challenges. If you've used R, you know that it's not an easy language to get used to. The syntax can be weird if you're coming from Python or MATLAB, but it's useful enough that it was worth overcoming the learning curve there. And if you're used to using a GUI for any spatial analysis that you do, if you're using ArcGIS or QGIS, then it's a little bit of a change in mindset for you because it's not as interactive. You're not natively. You're not panning around and zooming in. You can do that, but it takes a little work. So if you needed to do that, I would just pop it into a GUI and do it, and then figure out what your analysis needs to be. But it is interactive. It's not in the same way that your maps are interactive in, say, ArcGIS, but R is an interactive programming language, so you can run one line at a time, see what happens, plot the results. It's not a compiled language where you have to write your whole code, compile it, and test it that way. So in that situation, it's good for us modeling people. But there are trade-offs because that makes it a little bit slower than a compiled language. And also, all of your objects are stored in memory. And for some people, that makes you just want to write it off because I work with huge data sets. But I've processed 6.7 million Lidar tiles using R. And so there are ways to distribute the work, especially now with cloud computing and parallel processing. There are so many ways around that. You can break, if you're working with images, those are notoriously difficult. You can break them up into chunks and process them. So don't let that scare you away, but it is a consideration and something you might have to tackle in your code. Yes?
So the 6.7 million, was that from your laptop? Or did you use
I could
cloud
process, we did that on the cloud, but I could have done it on my laptop. They were tiny tiles. So they're easy to hold in memory. We grouped them into, I don't know, I forget, 250 at a time, and sent them off to Google Cloud, I think we settled on, and did our processing and just sent back the tabular data. So. Okay, so I'm going to show you some code and kind of what it does, just to get you familiar with what it looks like. And if you've used R before, feel free to ask or say, why didn't you use simple features or whatever. So there's a package in R called TMap that has a quick thematic map function. So if you just want to look at your data quickly, this is actually from my workshop that I taught here in August, and all of that code is available, and I'll give you guys a link at the end. And it's really, Lex can tell you, it's really over-commented. So if you probably won't have questions going through it. There's a lot of commentary about what's going on, but obviously feel free to ask. But so this, we looked at eBird data for New England, and I just want to plot a map of that by, what did I do? By common name. So I want the points colored by common name. I can put a title on it. I can add a compass and a scale bar, and I get, you know, a crudish kind of map. I could put my state boundaries back there if I wanted to or something. But in one line of code, you can pop this up and say, oh, okay, that looks pretty cool, and we'll do some analysis on it. And you can do this with ggplot. There's so many ways to do everything, but this was just a quick one-liner. Yeah.
How does it know where to place the different elements on the map?
Okay, so this object is a spatial points object. So a spatial points data frame, sorry. So it is basically like your shape file with the attributes with it. So it knows the X and Y. If it didn't, then you would have to plot, you could use ggplot or something and give it the coordinates, then it would know where to plot them. But yes, so,
Okay. So SP is spatial project.
Spatial points.
Spatial points. Okay.
Yeah. So I should mention that the dot, oh, I'm glad you said that. Okay, so in Python, I'm not a Python programmer, but you would have like the name of your object and then dot in a function. That's right. That's not how R works. So this is just the name of my object. In R, you can have a dot in the name. So the dot SP is just something that I named it. It's not, doesn't mean that, but yeah.
And the other map elements like the compass and so on, they automatically align just by default, but you could tweak them later with
Right.
another command.
Yeah, so it kind of smartly tries to put them where it thinks it'll look best or where there's room. But yeah, you can move those. Yep.
So then the other periods, are they not hierarchical? Is that not
The other,
objects?
Like symbol
Functions,
size?
symbol dot size, or symbol
those,
dot- those
okay.
names you made up.
No, the only name that I made up is this one. That's an object, that's a variable that I set that is a spatial object. The rest of it, everything that comes after a comma, those are arguments. So symbols.col, that's how I'm going to color the points. And I just tell it I want to use common name out of the attribute table as the color. So it'll find the unique common names. In this case, I only had 4 bird species in there and assign each one a different color. And then symbols.size is another argument, and that just changes the point size. The title is self-explanatory. This is for the legend. The symbol.title.color relates to this, and so I can give, otherwise it gave this name formatted like that, and I was like, well, that's ugly. I want it to be not all capitals, and I don't want the period in there, so I can change that name. And then, like we were discussing, these just, you can give them arguments and put them in certain places, but you don't have to. So cool. So that's not a bad map for a quick line. I mean, it's not great, but one cool thing we did, and it's in the code, in the workshop code, is I can look at individual years and then animate them. And so in your R, I'm using RStudio, but you can use Atom or whatever. RStudio is sort of my go-to, but then you can have an animation. You can write a GIF file that will show you in this case, the bird observations by species by year and cycle through. And that's another one line, GG animate, and boom. So it's cool. It's fun. Okay, so this is the stuff nobody likes to do or talk about because it's boring and aggravating usually, but data cleanup. So I'm going to give you this table and it's a mess and you have to make something wonderful out of it. Well, first we need to be able to format it properly in order to do the analysis. Dates are notoriously difficult in any language. R has some helper packages like the LibreDate package that this function as underscore date will try to guess the format of the dates that are in the column that you tell it. Problems happen when they're not all in the same format, but that's going to happen no matter what. But there are good functions in that package that will help you identify those problems, and you'll have to fix them. But yeah. The cool thing is once you tell R that something is a date as opposed to a character string, then you can start to do math on it. So I can ask for the max date, the last date in my observations. I can look for the median date, minimum. When I plot things, R knows what dates are. So if it's text and we don't tell it that it's a date, it'll plot every single one. So your x-axis, if you have a lot of days or dates in your data set, can get cluttered and you can't read it. You could have 1,000 dates under there. But if you tell R it's a date, it'll format it in a pretty way and space it out a little bit for you. Other common things that we come up against are duplicates in our data set or incomplete cases. Some of the modeling routines that I use, like random forest, will bomb if I give it any missing data. Other packages can handle that, but so to remove duplicates, there's a function called duplicated, and so the duplicated function looks for duplicates and will give you a true false for every row in your table. And so you can subset your object looking for ones that are not, so the exclamation point means not duplicated. And then you have a clean data set with no duplicates. Similar to that, you can subset your data set only for complete cases, excuse me. So again, complete cases, that function will tell you true or false. But if you pop it in these square brackets, which we use for subsetting and indexing tables, then we can ask for, I want my birds data frame or table, I don't know what it's called in Python, but only the ones that are complete cases. Questions?
What do you mean with that?
Complete case meaning there's no NA values or missing data.
Do you have any way to parameterize it, or it's just checking for missing values?
That's just checking for missing values. You mean if you want to change it? You can, I don't know what I mean by parameterize it. But.
So for example, if I want to extract rows which don't have +1 attribute. Yeah, that's more complicated, but okay. Yeah. So this line will just remove any rows that have any missing data. But yes, you can tell it only in certain columns. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, you can.
Is there a difference between using these sorts of select statements and using the built-in unique and NA omit functions?
Unique is different in that you can't use that on a data frame. That's for a vector. So say I have a column that's the year and I want to know what years are in my data set. I can say unique birds $ is the way we call a column name, birds $year, and that'll say, oh, you have years 2004 to 2010 or something. And what was the other thing you asked?
NA omit.
NA omit.
Instead of complete cases.
NA omit. That does give you a different answer. I need to look it up exactly how it's different. But I have used that before. There's also a bunch of functions if you don't need to remove them. So if you just want to calculate the mean of one of your columns, and there are NA values in it, you don't have to remove them. Oftentimes those types of functions will have an argument that says NA.rm, do you want me to remove the NAs before I do the calculation? So you don't always have to do this, but sometimes you do. And I definitely, I've used NA omit, and I can't remember what the output looks like, but I'm going to check it after we, yeah.
I think it's going to be basically the same, except NA omit is going to attach some extra attributes that sometimes they are usually sort of annoying.
Yeah.
So it basically gives you an extra attribute that says
If it
which ones.
Yeah, I can't remember now. That one just is so clean and easy. That's the one I usually use. But yeah, there's usually more than one way to get at what you're trying to do. So this one's a little bit more complicated, or it looks more complicated. So for vector processing, so we're getting into the spatial work now, you can read in any type of spatial object that GDAL can use. And you can also read in text files and then later specify them as a spatial object. So in this case, before this line, I read in a text file that has X and Y coordinates in it. So in that, when it reads in, it's just a table. There's no, R doesn't know that it's spatial, but I can tell it that it's spatial with this, this function here. And I just give it some coordinates that came right out of that table. I tell it which data I'm using and what the projection is, and then I can map it the way I did in that first map. Reprojection is from the SP package, which is a base package that you need to have if you're going to do any spatial work with vectors or rasters. But this is just transforming my spatial object up here to a different projection.
So it's GDAL that does all the reprojection?
Yeah, it's in the background, yeah.
Okay, so our talk with GDAL, you need to tell, or you just install the two software and that's it? Or
Yeah, so there's a package called rGDAL. There's a package called GDAL utils, which you can call GDAL functions directly in R. Otherwise, you could use a system command to call GDAL, but these are using GDAL in the background. Yeah, so when this installs with all its dependencies, it'll look for GDAL. And if you don't have it, it'll crash and tell you need to install GDAL. It doesn't install system software, but it'll tell you what's missing.
What is GDAL?
GDAL is the Geospatial Data Abstraction Library. Is that right?
That's
Wow. I don't know where I pulled that from. It's a collection of tools that you can use to work with geospatial data. So instead of saying in R using SP transform, you could write at the command line tools, say GDAL warp, and then your image, and then your projection.
But no one uses it.
No, they do. Yeah, I use it. Yeah, like if I have a directory full of images and I want to know what the projections are, I'll probably just go in my terminal and say GDAL info, one of the images. I don't know. Do you guys use GDAL?
Yeah.
At the command line? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even QGIS is using GDAL in the background. I think even ArcGIS is for some things. So it's one of those sort of base level things that a lot of other tools use, but you can also use it at the terminal. Cool. You can also do any of the other things that you would typically do with GIS software, intersecting, clipping, dissolving, or aggregating. This one's cool. I did not know this before I was preparing for FOSS4G, and you always learn a lot more about the topic that you're about to be teaching about when you have to teach it. So R understands what these brackets mean as an index. So if you have a table and you say that I want my table and then square brackets 1, 1, that's the first row, the value at the first row, the first column. If the object that is outside the brackets is a spatial object, in other words, it has coordinates and R knows what they are, then when you use those brackets, you can put another spatial object in there and it knows to just clip it spatially, which is very cool. And that was a new one for me. But yeah, dissolving, intersecting is almost the same as clipping, but you'll get all the attributes from both data sets, which is often important.
And so when you do a function like that in the newly saved data frame, that's where you have all those new,
Yes, so you could either write over your existing object, which
or you can name a new
is
one.
usually
You've got
not
new one.
a good idea, yeah, or you could name a new one.
What's the, so county comma blank, is that how you get the index? That comma is needed?
Yeah, so usually it, for a table, if you wanted all the rows that, so let's see.
So by not defining the other half, it just gets everything.
Yes.
Okay.
It's different for a table because for a table, it's row column. And so if you don't put anything for the row and you put something for the columns, it'll give you all the rows and vice versa. And so for spatial stuff, it's just the convention to put it with the comma after. Yes.
When you aggregate, how are the attributes treated? In a table, like all the other columns, what's the rule when you merge them?
Yeah, so all your attributes can't come through at the same level that they were. So if you're going from county to state, you're going to lose some. Yeah. So what comes through? Your states come through, and you know, I'm not actually sure about the other attributes, what they look like when they come through, or which ones come through. I think what comes through is, yeah, I'm gonna guess it's just the state name, but I can get back to you on that one. Anything else? Summarizing data, and this is starting to get into a little bit of analysis work. So back to my birds. We can use a function called tapply, which stands for table apply, to summarize my observation counts, so for each state. And I have to tell it how I want to do that. And so my last argument here is sum. So then I just get a clean table with each state and the count of observations, the sum of the observations for each state. That's a handy one. And then once you have done a little bit of work, you can also summarize your data visually. So you can make Choropleth maps, and I'll show you some other examples of those. Here is a kernel density map showing birding hotspots based on those counts. And then a bar chart showing the observations per year per species. There's just some examples of how you could visualize the data as we're starting to get it into a format for analysis. Yes.
What's that hotspot that's on fire?
That's where there's a lot of birding, and I have not been up. So this is so if you look at the species that I have on here, this is mostly pigeons. I don't know what's going on out here, but I would like to know what's going on out there. It's pretty cool.
It's a wildlife refuge.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not surprising. Yeah, so that makes sense. Raster processing, near and dear to my heart, and I actually won't. Do any of you guys work with rasters? Oh, good. Good, good. Okay, so you can do any of the things that you do normally with rasters using GDAL or QGIS or ArcGIS or Imagine or Envy. And maybe not everything, but a lot of things. Clipping, masking, reprojecting, band math. You can make new vegetation indices, which is what I'm working on now and is super fun. And then, I don't know if you guys can read that, but once you start sort of playing, right now in this situation, I was playing with a raster and vectors, so I want to extract the raster value, in this case, canopy cover value, to my bird points so that I know if some birds are found where there's more canopy cover or less canopy cover, and that's just a simple extract my raster to my points. It's the same thing as extract values to points in ArcGIS. And so my new table has another column on it for canopy cover, and then I can start to do some neat graphs over here like these density plots, and you can see that the ovenbirds sort of prefer a higher canopy cover than pigeons, for example, which is very good because if that did not show up, I don't know what I would say about this. And then this is just the code for that plot. And I'm happy to go over it if anybody wants to, but I don't want to bore you with code, so it's up to you guys. It's ggplot. Again, coloring based on the common name. The fill is the inside and the color is the line that's on the outside, and then I'm just setting it a little bit transparent so that we can see through them.
Which part breaks it into the 6 plots for each state? One for each state.
Oh,
Is that just
that's
because-
cut off.
Oh,
That
okay.
is a facet wrap on state. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, so there would be another plus here, facet wrap on the state column, and it puts it into 6 plots for you very nicely. Getting closer to some modeling and stats. Now we're looking at correlation, pairs of correlations. And this function, the function that built this graph is just built in. I did not do any parameterization on that. That's just how it spits out. You can change it. You can make it colorful. You can change what goes in here. But I mean, that's a pretty nice thing to just shoot out from a table where I'm looking at canopy. I want to know the relationship between canopy cover, impervious surface, and NDVI. NDVI is a vegetation index that, if you're not familiar with remote sensing, it is sort of proxy for vegetation health. So these are crappy correlations, and I'm sure yours would be better, but just as an example of some things you can do that aren't super hard. Yeah.
So the 3 canopy cover, impervious surface, and NDVI, those are all rasters, but it's being correlated to the bird points. Is that what's going on?
They are rasters, and then I extracted the raster, the pixel values to the bird points, and that's what I'm
That's what's
plotting.
plotted, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Nice.
Cool. And then more code. We're almost done, sort of, with code. But you can make some nice Choropleth maps. This is the Choropleth R library, and I didn't even bring in county or state boundaries. That's just if you do work with census data or you're working at summarizing data at administrative levels, this package has some of those things built in, so US counties and states. So it makes it easy to, if you're using other data sets that are not in this package, you would have to like do this by hand. But this makes it easy to just say there's a function in there called county Choropleth, and it knows that this is going to be popped into the county boundaries, which is just kind of cool. So these are some anomalies of, I don't even know what this was, but I think crop yields for 1 year anomalies. Yep.
On your previous slide, in your correlation, is there a way to plot this is used on the map or check for autocorrelation, big autocorrelation?
Residuals on a map?
Yeah.
Yes. So I would probably do this. Where what's your unit? Like, what are you using administrative?
You can predict birds by the 3 factors, right?
Oh, yeah. Oops.
So those 3 factors, are they autocorrelated? Are they correlated themselves? Are they spatially autocorrelated? In your regression model, how do you account for it?
Yeah, so they're not super correlated, except for maybe NDVI and canopy cover, which is not surprising. So I guess it depends on your modeling framework and if it matters if they're correlated, or if you care if they're correlated in terms of being able to explain the model, or if you're just trying to get the best model that you can get. There are packages that will help you with spatial autocorrelation, or at least identifying it. I didn't do that here. It was just, yeah, but you can do that. And you can plot, so if you did a linear model between this and, say, bird species presence and absence or something, however you want to do this model, you can plot residuals if it's a numeric model. It wouldn't be with presence absence, but or probability of presence. And if you do a linear model, a residual plot is part of the output. So
Plot or map?
a plot, and you can map them if you know, you can map them to the points and color them by the residual. Cool. Any questions about choropleths? Okay, so biomass mapping. Again, this is an example of a project that was done pretty much A to Z using R, and it was done while I was at the Woods Hole Research Center, still being done. So what I'm showing you are kind of preliminary results. You guys, anyone interested in forest biomass may have seen a paper just came out a couple weeks ago in Science that showed that tropical forests are net sources of carbon and not sinks, and that was done by my former colleagues at the research center. So this is not that work, but it is a precursor to that work that we did in Mexico, where we have been working there since 2011 with the government of Mexico, trying to work with them on a carbon management system, a carbon accounting, helping them figure out what's going on in their forests and what that means for their carbon, if they're a source, if they're a sink. Mostly this is geared towards red, if you're familiar with that. And so this project, we were trying to demonstrate that we could map annual changes in forest biomass directly at the pixel level. So other ways of doing this, or other approaches, often involve using a land cover map that shows deforestation, for example, and then you have a biomass map, and you would just pull out the pixels that were deforested and calculate emissions from that. We're trying to go look at direct emissions and gains that are measurable across large areas and through time. So we're tracking pixels, basically. What's the trajectory over time? Is this one pixel in 2003 a forest? What is it in 2004, 2005? And you can actually graph that. And then over the entire country, we can start to look at national emissions. The other sort of benefit of doing that is that we're not only capturing deforestation, we're also capturing degradation, which is, in that paper that was just published, a huge, I think it said accounted for 64% of the emissions. And it's just never captured because we're using a land cover map that's not sensitive enough to degradation. And so this method captures that. It also captures gains, which that's hard to do because they're smaller usually than the losses, unfortunately. And so really this is just a scaling project, and that is a big oversimplification there, but we have field plots where we know a lot about what's going on the ground, We know the height of the trees. We probably know the height of every tree in the plot, and we've used allometric equations to calculate the biomass. Then we fly Lidar where we have field plots, and I'll show you a map of what that looks like. And so we've got Lidar coverage over these field plots, and we can start to look at relationships between what's on the ground and what we see in the Lidar. And we can do that really, really well. The next step is, so we don't have Lidar, we don't have field plots everywhere, so we fly some Lidar, but we also don't have Lidar everywhere because that would be super expensive. So we use satellite imagery for yet another scaling piece, another model that goes from the Lidar-based biomass map up to the national level, either MODIS or Landsat, which is why I wasn't specific there, VIIRS. And so The map on the right shows our forest inventory plots, and we had a lot of them. And then the blue and black lines are the LiDAR. The black lines we had flown, and the blue lines were flown by NASA. And I'm going to focus on the pieces that are in the red box here because those are the parts that I worked on and that I feel like I can coherently talk about those. The bottom bit is scaling from the biomass map up to the satellite imagery, and I know how it was done with a model, and I didn't work on that, but I can show you the results from it. So I'm just going to breeze through this a little bit. So the point here is that I wasn't able to process my LiDAR data in R until very recently. And so my process before that was to convert, I got 1 kilometer last tiles, that's the format that LiDAR data comes in, from my vendor, and I needed those to be in 30-meter tiles because that's going to be the resolution of my map at the end. So I would do that in LAS tools, but unfortunately, R cannot read a LAS file until recently. Now it can. It couldn't read a LAS file, so I would have to convert all of those LAS files to text files. So now I've just duplicated my entire data set. So I had 6.7 million LAS tiles, 30-meter, tiny little things, and now I have double that, and I have taken up a whole bunch of space, and it's super expensive. It's hard to process. It's a pain, all of that. But once we get by that, then for every tile, I want to calculate metrics that are based on the structure of the LiDAR that are in those tiles. So maximum height, median height. We did some Fourier analysis. We had a lot of metrics, hundreds of columns of metrics. So we did some custom metrics. We calculated some traditional metrics that we use Fusion software for, which is software from the Forest Service. And we did our modeling in R, and then we did our mapping in R. Yay, we have a map. And then in 2015, a new package came out that could read LiDAR data directly as a LAS file into R. The only problem was this was really for use on small files. It's super slow. I haven't used it in a while, so maybe they've changed it. And it has a limited number of functions, and it's really geared towards if you're looking at individual trees and trying to look at the shape of individual trees. And that's not, I'm looking at a whole country of trees. So I kind of passed that by and went back to my other method. But then in 2016, at the end of 2016, my friend, JR, wrote this package. He's my friend now, after he wrote this package. He was nice enough to come and present some of this work with me at Phosphor-G also, so that was great to get to meet him. But he created this package, and that's those 3D visuals from the LiDAR data that we looked at before. Those are from this package. And that's one line of code, plot, LAS file, and you get this beautiful colored 3D. You can rotate it and zoom. But this allowed a lot more functionality. So now I can build terrain models from my LAS files. I can normalize my LAS files, which means remove the terrain, so I just have the height of the vegetation, which is important for biomass mapping. I can clip the LiDAR to my field plots. I can filter. I still can do individual tree stuff if I want to. So this package was a lifesaver. So back to my biomass stuff. Now I can read the LAS file and plot what it looks like if it's small. If it's huge, I don't suggest doing that because, again, R is holding everything in memory.
Just a question. Doesn't Lidar upgrade LAS files? I was wondering.
I don't think so. I don't think so. Someone in here can correct me if I'm wrong, but we were using LAS tools, which we paid for, and that would have been silly if GDAL could do it. So
Yeah, that's why I was wondering.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, like I said, you can quickly pan and zoom around. And I know you can't read this. Yes.
Do that plot is one tile at a time, or can you inject multiple tiles from the DM?
It really depends on your machine. It takes a lot of space to do that. But I think you would have to merge them first, which you can do in a format that doesn't take up a lot of space, like a
So
compressed.
you do need to merge them, mosaic them first and then do the plot. The plot cannot take multiple
Right.
files.
At least not at this point. I know he's working on a newer version, but last I checked. Okay, so you're not really meant to read this, but if you haven't worked with Lidar before, as part of the last file format, it comes with a header which gives you information about the point density, the number of points, the area, the extent, your min and max, X, Y, and Z, and you lose all of that when you read it in as a text file. So this is really nice to have this ability to read it in directly from the last file. And if you have not seen the data that come from a Lidar acquisition, it's basically just a big table with X, Y, Z, intensity, information about the returns and the angle. Most of the vendors will classify the points for you. So is it ground? Is it vegetation? Do they not know? Is it unclassified? I just talked about this. So this is what the raw last file would look like. You can see that there's some terrain in there, and this is probably a big bump over here. When you're doing biomass mapping, you don't want effects of the terrain. So these are elevation values. So this value could be like 2,000. They're not heights. So I need to know the forest height to be able to relate that to my field plots. So I create a ground elevation grid from my last file, which is one line of code that I'll show you in a second. And then I subtract one from the other. And now you can see this is flat. And now these values are heights. So it could be like 20 meters, not 2,000. And the code for that, so there's two pieces of code here. One is creating the DTM from using the last package, or the Lidar package in R, and then normalizing it. And then this is what I used to do. So I would have to create my DTM outside of R using LAS tools or something else if it wasn't provided by the vendor. And then I would have to read it in as a table and define all the table headings, use the raster package to extract the DTM to my points, and then physically subtract them. So this JR made my life a lot easier by producing this package. And then I can start to do a whole bunch of fun things with this. So I can clip out my field plots. So now I have LAS files that are just the shape of my field plots. And I can start to look at the structure of the forest in those plots and calculate metrics, build profiles. So I know the biomass here, and I can look at the shape of the profile and see like, oh, this has quite a complicated understory, whereas, I don't know, this one is basically nothing, and you can see it has a very low biomass. And that feeds into some modeling. So again, I've clipped out my points. These are, I know the biomass, I know when it was collected, and now I've also calculated all these metrics about what's going on in this plot, and that's based on the Lidar. I can combine those into a model, so whatever kind of model you want to use, multiple regression, random forest, GBM, I don't know, whatever you want to use, to predict biomass over the rest of the Lidar acquisition. So I can apply that model to every LAS file I have now. And you can see that, and this is a bad cartography here because these points are red and they're hard to see, but the red points are my field plots. So those are the areas that I know with as much certainty as I can what the biomass is. I've created a model based on the Lidar that overlaps that, and then I've applied it everywhere. So now the next step, which I was not heavily involved in, would be a wall-to-wall map where I relate the Lidar-based biomass map to satellite imagery. And that looks like this. So, and it looks pretty, it's preliminary. This is based on MODIS, so this is 500 meter. And then because we did this over 14 years, so this is the 2014 map, we can look at changes. These are significant changes, like 95th percentile changes. We can see losses in red and gains in green, and various things in between. And we can look at error. So that kind of wraps up my talk and my case study information. I just really wanted to do a word map because they're fun. But these are a lot of the spatial packages that I use. I'll make this presentation available to you guys if you're interested in looking at any of that, as well as where to get help and some other resources. Stack Exchange and Stack Overflow, Lifesavers. These are all links, so just to different little cheat sheets if you want to start playing with R. And that is the link to, that GitHub link is the link to the Phosphor G workshop materials, and a lot of the visuals that you saw in this presentation came from that, and it would have all the background code in there too. So the other thing I wanted to mention, which I'm glad I wrote on the board, is that at Teleslabs we're building an Earth database. We're not sure, we're settling on that terminology, but basically a database of satellite and other information that are summarized by administrative levels. So maybe at the county level, the state level. If we're looking at global, we might be looking at different municipalities. And that we're hoping that that kind of database could be useful for data scientists and academics. And so right now we're really solidly in the agriculture field, but these features that we're building can be used for any kind of modeling. And so we're looking for some non-ag people, or ag, if you're doing ag's fine too, to work with us and kind of test it. For we're not ready yet, but when we are, to kind of test it for us and see if it's useful to you in your research. So if anybody's interested in talking more about that or potentially kind of checking it out for us, that would be awesome. But other than that, thank you for listening, and take any questions.
So we can do questions. I know it's 1 o'clock and people have to leave, so feel free to do that if you need to, but we have room till 1:30 and we can do some questions here.
Early on, you mentioned R notebooks, and I may have missed it towards the end.
Oh, yeah.
Is that different than Jupyter notebooks?
It's similar, the same idea.
Is it different?
It's just, yeah, so here's an example where I'm just kind of comparing some different vegetation indices, and you can see that I have like a little table of contents here and some text, some previews of some tables, some graphs, just kind of all integrated, and also the code. Well, that's a bad example. Somewhere, code, no, code. I don't know, code, some code. So I can share this with my colleagues. This is a live HTML, so whenever I refresh it or add more stuff, they can kind of see what's going on or how things have changed. So I really like that for sharing. If I want to share my results in that way, especially if it's a work in progress. I mean, you can write full reports using that. I have not done that yet, but.
It's just I Google for R notebooks.
So I write it, just here's what it looks like. I'm just writing it in R Studio. And it's part of our studio, and then I have a separate code that uses R Markdown to render that code into an HTML or PDF or whatever. If it's HTML, then you can use Plotly or Shiny and Leaflet and make things interactive, which is fun. Don't look at that, that's terrible. Yeah.
So you mentioned simple features. I kind of, so I don't do that much GIS stuff. I do a lot of art.
Yeah.
In general, but not much GIS. So I sort of like follow this stuff, but kind of like from afar.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then earlier in the presentation too, you had this slide like, is R the new GIS? And I sort of like get the impression, again, I'm not like deeply involved in this stuff, but just sort of mailing lists and just impressions that I get from sort of keeping abreast of some of this stuff is that to some extent like JavaScript has become the new GIS, and that a lot of the new sort of GIS stuff, so there's like all the old SP based GIS stuff and all, and it seems like a lot of the new stuff is like JavaScript based,
Mm-hmm.
so wrappers for popular GIS JavaScript libraries, simple features, which I think sort of is in that same sort of vein.
Yep.
I'm just sort of curious about your thoughts of like this old SP-based approach, what it seems like you're mostly using, versus the new simple features JavaScript-based things that are coming out.
Yeah, so simple features are, that seems like it will replace SP. The reason that I have not really used it is because as a remote sensing person, I am using the raster package like constantly, and that has not been updated to work with simple features yet. But as soon as it is, I'm over. It's just a lot simpler.
Yeah.
Why it's called simple features. As far as the JavaScript stuff, I can't really speak to that. I don't see a lot of my colleagues in research doing that. I do see my colleagues on the front end work using high charts and all this cool like D3 stuff, and it's awesome. But as far as like the research and the analysis, no. What else? Who wants to beta test for us?
Can you
Nobody.
explain what you're looking for?
Yeah, so we're trying to build a database of features for data scientists or people who are doing modeling, basically. Features that would be useful for modeling economic issues or environmental issues. I guess I don't want to constrain it, so I don't want to say too much, but you know, it might be that we have say a table by geographies, different geographies, and we have some remote sensing data summarized by geography, or I mean, we have a lot of ag stuff, different crop health, yields from different years, but I feel like we have weather data, meteorological, wow, that's hard to say, data that come in every day. Also the satellite data comes in every day. So if there's something, you know, that can be, that some modeling application that you guys have that you think like, wow, NDVI summarized at the county level might be really cool for me to add this into my modeling, or that's kind of what we're looking for. Also just, you know, what features are you guys looking for? What right now we're kind of focusing on administrative levels rather than pixel level things, but like what boundaries do you want to see some of these features summarized to? So it might be like ecoregions or something like that, and not counties, and we can do that. So we're in the beginning stages of building this, so it's not ready for a test yet, but probably in a few months.
And the goal is to then deliver it with package in R?
It probably won't be R, actually. It'll probably be some sort of API driven.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That you hit.
You can query it. Yeah.
Talking about the type of spatial boundaries to develop, I think watershed or sub-basin, you know, multiple levels would be a really useful unit.
So I'm familiar with the HUC boundaries in the US. Are there like global boundaries that you guys trust? We're having trouble even with country boundaries right now.
Well, the trouble is the political boundary, because different people draw it different ways.
Yeah, well,
If
yeah.
you're looking at, you know, reasonably high resolution digital terrain model, then you can delineate watershed without anybody having a say.
Yeah.
So that would probably be actually less controversial to apply.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That would seem to be particularly important with the shifting towards arid areas, not just from deforestation in general.
Yeah.
Just desertification, I mean, that's practically changes everybody's lives,
Yeah.
or sea ice.
Sea ice. Yeah, we have not tackled that yet. We're still on land.
And I'm not an area user, but I noticed that in QGIS, in the processing toolbox, there is an R user interface. Is it useful in any way? Or
I'm
can
gonna,
it be used for working in projects, or it's only experimental?
I think it's useful. So I would tend to just stay in my programming world, but actually I might let Lex answer that because he just did a tutorial on that very thing.
My understanding is that the R script in processing is actually just running R.
Yeah.
So if you have R installed, you could run whatever R you want in your R script inside of the QGIS. It's basically just a console.
Yeah, maybe,
However, you don't have all the bells and whistles that like RStudio has.
but maybe
so-
it's nice because you can write a model using different algorithms.
You
from
can use other things from processing.
Saga,
that
toolbox,
actually
and mix
Tina-
them together.
Yeah, Tina was mentioning that some things are actually better to run not in R. So
Yeah,
QGIS might be a good place to hybridize, the routines that you want to run and model.
And the reverse of that is there's an RQGIS package for R that if you find something that's buggy in R and it works in QGIS, you can run the QGIS function in R. So, it's really interchangeable. You can talk to Postgres databases. It's not I'm only using R now at all. It's like everything sort of flows back and forth.
There's a plugin for GIS as well. Our plugin.
So should we stop here and carry on the conversation if anybody wants to stay? And I just want to thank everybody about coming here and thinking about how we can merge R with GIS and bring statistics people together and all talk to each other about spatial data and processing. So I think Tina is just the perfect person to invite. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Yeah, we
I
should.
did have one more question.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So I want to go back to something you said in your very first slide about the learning curve.
Yep.
Okay, so here's my situation. I've inherited a bunch of hard code. And my colleague
That's horrible.
I could call him on the phone and all. But I'm trying to make a decision whether I should learn it or not, or whether I should take this code and translate it into a language that I'm very familiar with. Because the concepts are all there, the comments are there, the logic is there, I understand where it's going. Your comments on the learning curve. I'm going to be starting from scratch.
What are your alternative languages?
Python, and/or in this case, I could actually do the analysis manually, maybe just as efficient. He did it because he walked in as a statistician, he walked in at UR, he did it in R, he came out, the results were there, he got a pilot. And I'm trying to scale it up.
Yeah, manually scares me now.
Well, it's not a hard project. But
Yeah.
Don't focus on it.
Yeah. Okay, so that's an option if you're more comfortable with Python and you understand what needed in R.